We're unleashing Dr. Frank Hollenbeck once again. He answers to absolutely no one, so he can say exactly what he thinks. So thank you for joining me in the studio again, Dr. Frank. Let's start by talking about Spain. 5.4 million, that's the amount of people unemployed in Spain. It's a pretty dreadful situation, isn't it?
Absolutely. We saw that Spain just indicated that it will not meet its budget deficit target of 6%, and it's going to be something above 8%, which means that's about a 20 billion euro gap, and they're going to try to close that gap with 9 billion euros worth of spending cuts and 6 billion euros worth of additional taxes. I think we can draw two conclusions from this. The first one, that it's very difficult to do an austerity program when you have a recession. And that's going to be the case in Europe. We're probably going to have all European countries in a recession next year. And it's even more difficult to get your debt down. The second thing we can learn from this is that the government said they didn't get the right numbers from its previous socialist government, which means that, again, like I said before, we have a situation where you can't trust European governments to give you the right number. And it's highly probable that France will have a socialist government this year, actually. And you have to wonder if we're going to see the same thing like we saw in Greece and now we're seeing in Spain, whether the governments will actually publish the correct numbers on their deficits and their debt levels.
That sounds like you're implying that socialist governments aren't honest.
Well, we saw that in the case of Greece and in the case of Spain. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, let's move on to the European Central Bank. We have a lot to talk about today. There seems to be speculation growing that there'll be some form of QE in 2012 from the European Central Bank because of deflation. What does deflation mean for the Eurozone?
Well, that's a very good question. You're absolutely correct that the European Central Bank is in the process of a significant amount of quantitative easing. The European Central Bank is likely to say that because of the risk of deflation, and that deflation is terrible, that they need to do this quantitative easing. And I need to explain to you why is deflation bad. And the easiest way, I think, is with an example. Suppose that you have 10 pencils and $10. Okay? What's the price of the pencils? The price of the pencils will be $1 per pencil. Okay? The reason it won't be $2 is that if it was $2, you'd have 5 pencils that nobody could purchase. So in other words, you'd have pencils that people wanted to sell that they couldn't sell. So they would reduce the price. The reason the pencil price is not 50 cents is because at 50 cents, you'd have people with money with no pencils to purchase. So in other words, it's basically supply and demand that would bring us to $1 for 10 pencils. Now, suppose that for some reason, and we're actually seeing it now in southern banks, we have people take $5 out of the system and stuff them in the mattress. Okay? To a large degree, that's what we're seeing now in southern banks. You have to understand is that the public and banks can reduce the money supply. The public by increasing their cash holdings, and the banks by deleveraging their positions. So that's really what is happening in Europe today, is that we're seeing a drop in the money supply. We can just look at the monetary aggregates, and we can see the money supply is dropping. And the idea is for the central bank to replace that money. Okay? Now, let me explain with this very simple example. Suppose that we have the public take out $5. Okay? So now we have 10 pencils and we have $5. Okay? So you would think that the price would go from $1 to 50 cents. Now, if input prices are flexible, in other words, if the price of the wood, the lead, the rubber, and the labor that goes into making the pencil, for example, suppose it was 80 cents, and you sold it for $1, so you made a 25% profit. Okay? If input prices fell, then there wouldn't be any problems. In other words, profitability of businesses would be the same. In other words, input prices would fall to 40 cents, okay? And the selling price would be 50 cents, and they'd be making the same profit rate. The fear of deflation is that their fear is that input prices would not fall as quickly as output prices would fall. So in other words, if wages were fixed, okay, and they couldn't fall, in other words, if input costs couldn't fall below 80 cents, you basically have businesses producing things at 80 cents and only being able to sell them for 50 cents. And the fear is that this would lead to bankruptcies, to multiple firings. You'd have a rise in unemployment, and that would actually, maybe we'd have a reduction in the number of pencils, okay? In other words, instead of 10 pencils, we don't have 8 pencils, in which prices would even fall even more, okay? That's really the main argument against deflation, is that there isn't a fast enough adjustment in the input prices relative to the output prices. Okay. The second argument is that if the deflation is unanticipated, it basically benefits lenders instead of borrowers. And in other words, if the inflation is anticipated, it basically means that lenders get a net benefit relative to borrowers. And at the moment, we basically have a lot of borrowers, which is whether it's the private sector or it's the private sector or it's the public sector. And you might think this is a zero-sum game, okay? In the sense that creditors would win when borrowers would lose. That is true, okay? But in the case we're in today, it would mean that governments would find it even more difficult to finance their debt. The reason is in a deflation environment, prices would be dropping, which means TVA tax would be dropping, wages would be dropping, that means income taxes would be dropping. So you can imagine, is that you have a fixed payment, but your revenues are dropping because of deflation. So the fear is that what would happen is, as a lender, okay, the lenders would get hurt relative to the creditors. Now, what a lot of people say is, well, let's just have the central bank come in and just make $5. Okay, in other words, the public has pulled out $5. We could have the central bank just come in and put $5 into the system so that prices would remain. We'd still have $10 and 10 pencils so that we wouldn't have this deflation. Okay, now there are two things that are important in this first example, is that when the central bank comes in, you have to understand is money is a measure of value, just like a meter is a measure of distance. Okay, think of how difficult it would be to build a house if every day a meter with a different distance. It's the same thing with central banks. When they come in and print money, what they're doing is they're influencing the value of money and makes it much more difficult to determine to determine the value of money in terms of prices. Now, what would happen is that so that would be the first effect. The second effect is that if the central bank comes in and prints $5, okay, what that's going to do is change relative prices. Okay, and I indicated before the importance of relative prices in a capitalist economy. The second problem with this is that what happens when the people who have pulled out the $5, they put their money back in? In other words, the central bank has put $5 in the system, it's avoided the deflation, but what happens when things get back to normal and that people who pulled out their money put the money back in? Do prices go to $1.50? And what does the central bank have to do? Do they have to pull this money out and create another dysfunctioning of the price system? Okay, and I think that's the biggest fear we have in the United States with its quantitative easing. A lot of people say, well, you know, what the central bank did, it avoided a very sharp depression, okay, in 2008. My view is that is the central bank intervening going to cause us 20 years of relatively ups and downs? Okay, I'd much rather have had a really sharp drop where unemployment went to 30% and then be out of the woods after a year than spend the next 20 years with relatively low growth and recessions. Okay, so that's one of the big problems, is that what's going to happen in the future if we have the central bank come in and actually put in these five extra dollars.
Okay, well, Dr. Frank Hollenbeck speaking to me there. We'll be back on Friday with more of the same, but for now, goodbye.